Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding at the beginning of, or a little bit of the way through, into Hakdamas Hamalaket of Tanya, the compiler's foreword, the Alter Rebbe's introduction, that the author, the Baal Tanya himself, wrote as an introduction to his work. And as we discussed last week, most of the Haskama is about why the Alter Rebbe should not be writing a book at all, or about why there is no good reason to write a book. That is what most of the Hakdama is about. That is the structure of the Hakdama. We said that the Alter Rebbe is, first of all, he opens the Hakdama by addressing all of his Chassidim, the people who are seeking God, and he addresses this to them as a letter, and he blesses them. And then he says that it's well-known, people say, it's a well-known saying, that you cannot replace seeing a teacher and learning directly from a teacher. You cannot replace that with a book or learning from a book. A teacher is irreplaceable, that's what people say. And the Alter Rebbe is now enumerating, he is now listing, he doesn't say the numbers, but he says 3 reasons why books cannot replace a teacher. And as I told you last week, it's easy, and we'll see this as a recurring theme as we learn Tanya, it's easy just to skip through the words of the Alter Rebbe, to just sort of go easily along and say, okay, there's all these reasons not to write a book, etc. And if you don't stop and realize and think a little bit about what the Alter Rebbe is doing here, you can miss the whole depth of what's taking place here. And in fact, as I mentioned last week, as I alluded to last week, we didn't really explain last week, we're going to see how this foreword sets you up in a whole different position than you would have otherwise to learn the Tanya. In other words, this introduction places us, it raises us up to a position where we're ready to study Perek Aleph, where we're ready to learn the first chapter, the first Perek of the Tanya. Last week we discussed the first 2. There's 3 reasons the Alter Rebbe is going to say why you cannot replace a teacher with a book. And last week we discussed 2 of these reasons. Number 1, the first reason is what we called by the general name bias. We said that everybody's soul, we actually divided it up into mind and spiritual sensitivity were 2 things. We said everybody has a different mind, a different way of understanding things, and everybody's holding in a different place in Avodah. They're holding in a different place in their service of Hashem with a different spiritual sensitivity, a different spiritual consciousness. And therefore, not every person merits to extract the Or Ki Tov, the hidden light, within the works that they are learning. In other words, every person comes with their own limitations, their own bias, their own blind spot, and even the things that they see, they don't see, so to speak, purely objectively. They see through their own lens. Whether it's intellectually we're talking about, that everybody's intellect, of course, has limits. Every human intellect is a limited intellect. Every human intellect has its things that it can grasp more easily and its things that it has more difficulty grasping. And it also has, it colors the things that it grasps as well. And then furthermore, even once you get beyond the intellect, you have the more spiritual dimension, where not everybody has the sensitivity, even if they intellectually understand, they don't have the sensitivity to get at the transformative light within the Torah. In other words, even if they can understand technically what the Torah is saying, they don't get at the true message that would speak to them and that would change them and give them direction in their ethical life, that would give them direction in their situation. They understand it intellectually, what the Torah says, but they cannot crack open the Torah and get that true light that connects to them and that transforms them, right? This is what we mentioned last week. That's why the Gemara says that if someone merits, the Torah is like a healing potion, and if someone doesn't merit, the Torah can be like a potion of death, God forbid. The Torah itself is not enough. The person has to have the right way to receive the Torah, right? So this is the first reason why you cannot replace a teacher with a book, because when a person comes to a book, they come with all of their limitations. Now, the truth is, of course, when someone comes to a teacher, they also come with all their limitations, but what's the difference? The difference is that the teacher, from their end, can work to overcome these limitations. The teacher can say, you're not understanding this correctly, or you're not approaching this sensitively enough, right? Or you don't have the right angle on this. I can see that this isn't getting through to you. So let me explain it to you in a different way that maybe will suit your limitations better. Let me bring it down to the place where you are in a better way, etc. A teacher has the ability to do what a book cannot. A teacher can work with the limitations of the student. The book just says what it says. That's the fundamental difference between a teacher and a sefer. Yeah, a good teacher and a sefer, of course.
It's not for you, walk away.
That's also an approach. It's more of a Beis Shammai approach.
Well, the teacher also can have limitations.
Sometimes the most important lesson you can teach someone is that it's not for them and you chase them away. And see if they come back anyway. It can be an important lesson. Anyway, so you know the beginning to the famous story where someone comes to Hillel and asks him to teach him the whole Torah on one foot, right? And he says, what's hateful to you, don't do to others, and the rest is commentary, very, very, very famous Gemara. But you know that right before that, what it says is that he goes to Shammai first, and Shammai chases him out with a measuring stick. Right. Shammai says, someone who's asking questions like yours, thinking that they're smart questions, you don't really belong here. That itself was the first lesson. That's also an approach. It's not a.
What did he say about Rabbi Kiva answer?
What?
What did he say about Rabbi Kiva?
Hillel's answer. What did he say about it? I don't know. Good question. Good question. I don't know. I assume that he would disagree with this approach. I assume that for whatever reason, this is like the many other cases in the Talmud where they disagree, which ironically is actually going to be part of what we read today. We're going to read about Shammai and Hillel. Strangely, we've found our way back to, by accident, to Shammai and Hillel. By Hashgacha Pratis, by divine providence. So the first reason that we read last week that the Alter Rebbe says you can't replace a teacher with a book is because of bias, or a different way of putting it, bias is just the one word heading I gave it. One way, a different way of putting it, maybe a more precise way of putting it would be the limitations of the student is really the first level. The first reason why you can't replace a teacher with a book is because students are limited. That's the first reason. Then we read the second reason. Alter Rebbe says, furthermore, even if the student is ready, in other words, even if the student is ready to hear whatever the teaching is, and they could get it from a book because they are at the right spiritual place, and they're at the right intellectual place, and they're kli kibbul, they're a receptive vessel to this teaching, nevertheless, the sefer might not speak to the place where that person is. It might not speak to their situation. And the Alter Rebbe says, if the sefer is built on human understanding, then the minds can be different, right? One mind does not speak to another mind. And I just want to point out, I didn't really have a chance to do this last week because I was hoping to finish all three and then sort of go back. But this time, since we're doing review, I can start the process in the review now, right? I want to point out to you that the assumed premises, the assumed basis of the Alter Rebbe's 3 steps are minakal kaved. This is a building argument. It's progressive. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is not giving three separate points. The Alter Rebbe is building the 3 points one upon the other in the following way, right? You see that the first one, which is the limitation of the student, he says, what's it based on? It's based on the principle that minds are limited, right? A student's mind is limited, so they may not be able to receive. So you have the first mind in the equation, which is the student's, and you have the first problem, which is that the student's mind is limited, right? The Alter Rebbe says, aside from this, expanding on the same principle, if a minds are limited, then the limit of the teacher's mind is also a consideration in the Sefer. The limit of the mind that writes the book is also a consideration. So first consideration is the student's mind. Then the Alter Rebbe says, implied, based on the same principle that all minds are finite, that a human mind is not a perfect receptacle to all knowledge. Only God is really a perfect receptacle to all knowledge. A human mind is limited with its contours and with its biases and with its lenses and with its spiritual state. So too by teachers. In fact, teachers can have this issue as well. In what situation, says the Alter Rebbe? If the book is based on human intellect, if the book is based on human understanding, then that there is no assurance that that teaching speaks to each and every person. For the same reason, but you can see that it's a further step in the argument, right? First you have, if a person is just too limited to hear the message, then that's the simplest, right? Slightly more refined than that, slightly deeper, slightly more abstract, or at a further remove, and a further step in the argument, right? It's not that the two people speaking to each other are not within the realm of understanding. This is the second point. It's not that they're not like speaking the same language and they can't grasp what each other are, where each other are. There's a more refined difference, which is that the fundamental limitation of intellect, right? In other words, per se, not because the student is not in the place, right? The limit of seichel, the limit of the human mind per se, is that the human mind can only speak about what it's speaking about, right? In other words, any book based on human intellect, by definition, has limited subject matter. It cannot speak by definition to every situation. That's the second limit. The second if the first one is bias, I called the second one parochialism, right? Parochialism means like the book is out in Macon, and I have a problem here in Atlanta. The book is parochial. It speaks to someone, but it's speaking to someone in a town all the way over there. It's not speaking to me, right? And the Alter Rebbe's point is that every book based on human intellect is essentially parochial. That's the point the Alter Rebbe is making. If the book is written up in seichel enushi, human intellect, then the book by definition is parochial. It can only speak about what it speaks about and no more. It can only speak to certain situations and no more. Which situations? The situations that the mind who wrote the book grasped, and by definition any human mind will only grasp a finite number of those situations. So by definition, any book written according to human intellect has this limit. And as I pointed out in last week's class, when we say books written by human intellect, we're not, God forbid, talking about chachmas chitzonius. We're not talking about non-Torah wisdom, God forbid, which is a different category which we'll discuss later in the Tanya, hopefully at length, to really get a clear grasp of the Alter Rebbe's approach to such matters. What we're talking about is Torah that is derived, books of Torah, hadracha, of Torah, direction, right, of Torah ethics, instruction, maybe. Books of Torah instruction. You're looking at me like you never heard the word hadracha before.
No, I'm trying to see where you're
Thank
going.
you.
I lost you.
Pardon me. Books of Torah.
There's so many.
Books of Torah instruction, books of Torah direction that are written based on a human intellect, right? And I'll explain, we'll touch on that more in a second, are inherently limited.
So you're trying to say that the books that are trying to convey chokhmah elokit through men's mind are limited.
So
That's what
It's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question because fundamentally you're asking really is how can it be both Torah and human intellect?
Right.
What's the Alter Rebbe talking about exactly?
But that's not what you said. You said like any book written by a person
Yes.
other than written by Chochmah Chitzonit.
No. Again, there's books that are not Torah, just regular human wisdom. You can find them on the Amazon bestseller list. That's all anyone reads, by the way. It's very sad. If you go to the Amazon bestseller, it's all self-help books. It's self-help books and get rich quick and politics. That's all that's there. There's no. That's what everyone reads. Anyone is, and that's the people who still read, which is already a minority.
Right.
And politicians are reading on get rich fast. Then it's an explanation.
But don't assume that the politicians write their own books, by the way. But that's a separate issue.
They read.
No, I don't know if they even read their own books.
One about the rich.
Get rich quick.
Some of them have written more books than they've read, which is quite the accomplishment. But a self-help book is not what the Alter Rebbe is talking about. That's Chochmas Chitzonius. But Chochmas Chitzonius, until we get to like why it's called Chochmas Chitzonius, which is an interesting question, which literally means external or superficial wisdom, depending how you translate. Just assume Chachmas Chitzonius means non-Torah wisdom, and it could be anything. Chachmas Chitzonius is very broad, right? Philosophy, science, math, any non-Torah wisdom, anything you find from a textbook to the self-help books on Amazon and everything in between.
What do you call about the Zohar and things like this?
The Torah,
It's Torah.
parts of Torah, of course. Halachically, right? There's thankfully, not everything is like this, but thankfully, there's a halachic hagdara of what's Torah, right? That you can ask a Rav, which means everything is very clear, right? What's the halachic question? I mentioned this last week, but very briefly. The halachic question is, do you, and the Rebbe would speak about this in Sichos all the time, is do you have to make Birchat Torah before you're allowed to read this Sefer? And that's a question you can ask a Rav, right? And the Rav has to answer, which means that theoretically we can have a Rav paskin on what is Torah and what's not Torah, right? So in other words, to learn Sefer Azayah without saying Birchas HaTorah is Asr, it's Torah.
He's also quoting the Torah.
What?
Because he's quoting the Torah.
No. What we mean by Torah is not the Torah Shebichsav, we mean also the Torah Shebal Peh, and everything part of the Torah Shebal Peh, of course, all Torah. All Torah versus all non-Torah. I mean Torah in the most expansive term of the word, right? So what's a sefer in Torah that's written with human intellect, right? A sefer of Hadracha. So in the Chassidus Tanya, which is one of the books of commentary on Tanya I'm using to prepare this class, the way this is explained, and really there are a few Svarim I would trust more, because I know for a fact that some of the great rabbis who taught me in yeshiva were part of the editing of these Svarim, and some of the greatest Chassidus teachers that we have. They explain that what the Alter Rebbe is referring to here, and I'm not sure on what in other words, I don't know if it's the people who wrote that Sefer that came up with this, or if this is something that the Rebbeim said. I can't remember, unfortunately. They explain the difference, how I explained it last week. The difference is you have works that are founded on purely understanding the Divrei Chazal, the words of the sages, and the Torah tradition. And the only thing that the Sefer adds is an expansion on the teachings of the Torah tradition. But then you have other Svarim, which it's not just giving you the Torah tradition, it's really adding also ideas from common sense, logic, philosophy, life experience, and different things like that. And when you add those things in, you can still have a Sefer that's Torah, but you would also have ideas of Seichel Enushi within the Sefer, that it's adding to the understanding and the contextualization of the Torah in the Sefer. So I gave an example last week. I'm not sure if it's a perfect example. Some might disagree. The example I gave last week was the Mor Nevuchim of the Rambam, for example. Right? You have the Guide for the Perplexed, where the Rambam explicitly says that he is using some of the ideas of Greek philosophy as the basis of some of his ideas, right? So he says, for example, if the Rambam in the Mor Nevuchim says you have to use the best thing for a human being to do is to know God, and what do I mean by God and what do I mean by to know God? So we use this approach and these ideas that we are borrowing or that we are building on from Greek philosophy, ideas that are correct anyway, but I'm borrowing them from Greek philosophy, right? So in such a situation, you have a book that's giving you hadracha, that's giving you direction or instruction in how to live a good life. The Rambam says the highest, in the Mar Nevuchim's perspective on what's the highest life for a Jew is a person who knows God, right? And in fact, for a non-Jew as well, for everything, the highest form of perfection is the knowledge of God, right? And he has a certain definition of what that knowledge means, and that whole process is not explained purely with Divrei Chazal. It's explained also with Seichel Anushi, with logic and with good sense, right? And the point is not that it's less true. It could be 100% true, which is part of the edelkeit of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. It's part of the subtlety of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, which is this is part of what you miss if you're not paying attention here, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying it doesn't matter if every word that the Mar Nevuchim says is technically true, because it is Seichel Anushi, right? It is inherently limited. It's inherently parochial, to use the word I used, which means parochial means, put it in Google Translate. Parochial means, and we'll probably say something like kfari or something.
How do you spell it?
Also a good question. Of the village, right? Kafri? Probably Kafri, Ronnie.
This is the other one of urban.
Of ma?
The opposite of urban.
Urban, yes, nachon, sort of, yeah. It's like rural, but the emphasis, the connotation is, the knech in English is that it's not just rural. Parochial means you're not speaking to what's going on, right? Like if someone has an opinion, you say, it's parochial opinion. Like he doesn't know what's going on in real life. Like he's speaking out, he's out there somewhere, right? Yeah. He's speaking in his village. He thinks what's going on is what's going on in his village with his cow. He doesn't know what's going on in real life. So any sefer which is written with Seichel Anushi, with human intellect, any book that is written under such circumstances, by definition, right, cannot speak to, even if the person is ready to receive, the person is on the right wavelength intellectually, the person is on the right wavelength spiritually, they're ready to hear the message. Not necessarily is the message they need to hear contained in this book, because this book by definition cannot speak to everyone. It can only speak to who it speaks to. A fact I should point out, which maybe this is a support for my using of it as an example, something that the Rambam speaks about at length in his introduction to Mar Nevuchim, where the Rambam basically says that for the vast majority of people, this book is not what you're looking for. This is not for everyone. This is for who it's for. It's not for. It's written for a certain type of person, as the Rambam explains at length there in his introduction. You can go and read it. It's not for like every person is going to find what they're looking for in this sefer. That's because its whole approach is Seichel Anushi. Its whole approach is according to the human intellect, not purely expounding on the Torah, right? Rather adding ideas, common sense ideas from human intellect. You find anything good, Ronnie? On parochial?
No. Don't even know how to spell it.
We'll check later, God willing. Okay. So, what's the Alter Rebbe's raya, right? If you want to ask the Alter Rebbe, how do you see this is so? Not every time, by the way, does the Alter Rebbe give a raya. Not every time does he give a proof. For this idea, he gives a demonstration. He says, how do we see this as the case that Seichel Anushi is inherently limited, right? We see this in the case of the bracha we say when we see 600,000 Jews, right? When you see 600,000 Jews, you say the bracha Chacham HaRazim, which means the knower of secrets. What's the wondrous thing when you see so many people? The wondrous thing is that each of these people has a totally private reality, has their own issues and their own experiences, and God knows all of them. Implying what? Implying only God is the Chacham HaRazim.
Related to a church parish?
That's the other definition.
Does it have a Hebrew word for it?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. The implication of the blessing Chacham HaRazim, the knower of secrets, is that only God is the knower of secrets. only God is the one
Narrow-minded.
who knows. Yeah, narrow-minded. Good synonym. God is the only one who knows the secrets of each and every person. Which means, what does it mean? He knows their secrets, their razim, right? Which the word, by the way, the word raz, of course, for anyone who studies Kabbalah, you know that the word raz, first of all, the word raz is the gematria of
207.
which is Ur.
Right.
Raz is Ur. And what did we just say that the Alter Rebbe said was hidden in the Sfarim that the human mind might not be able to get out? Is the Ur Kitov, right? So anyone who studies Kabbalah knows that the Raz means the Ur, the same type of Ur that's hidden in the Sfarim that the person can't get out, right? That's what the God knows. Only God knows. What's something only God knows? Only God knows the way that this light speaks to each and every person's situation. So even if you have, right, because you could say, you put it to you like this way, the first step was bias, right, where the person is limited. But you could say, but we seem to be able to establish a common language and talk about things practically all the time, right? Like people can work together on a project, right? So I can overcome my bias enough, at least a little bit, right? And maybe I'm at the place where I can do it with a sefer, where I don't need another person to work towards me. Maybe their sefer is already enough within my wheelhouse, enough within my abilities, right, to share an objective reality. I don't need them working with me directly to reach that place. Sometimes you can learn something from a book. In other words, your mind and the book's mind can be close enough that you can absorb something from the book. You can get wisdom out of it, right? But the problem is that you could read the whole book and find out that despite the fact that you're able to understand each other in principle, he's not able to address your specific issue. He's not able to address your problem and speak to you directly, right? There is a fundamental inability of one mind to speak to another person's mind from the inside, right? There's a famous saying, which we'll discuss, God willing, in more classes, and it's very important in the context of Chassidus to understand what this means. But there's a very famous saying of our great philosophers. I believe it's either Rav Sajagan or Rav Yosef Alba. I cannot remember which one says. Ilu Yudaisev Ayisiv, which means if I knew God, I would be God. Right? The same is very much true with another human being, in truth. Right, which should give some hint as to what the Alter Rebbe's whole approach to life is going to be. The fact that these two things are similar, right? Which is that if you really knew another person, you would be them. Right? Every person fundamentally has different experiences, has a different private reality, and there's no assurances that someone else working with human intellect, which is like building a bridge outward, right? I'm looking at the world in a certain way, and I'm trying to bring other people into that same understanding. I'm trying to bring other people and reach them with the same idea, right? Not necessarily is that idea going to be the idea that reaches everyone. Everyone is different, fundamentally. That's the second point. The second point is that not every person will merit to get the teaching out of the Sefer. Why? Because the Sefer was written with human intellect, the Sefer was written by a finite human mind, and only God is the Chacham HaRazim. Only God can speak to everyone's perspective as if from within their perspective. And the last thing we read last week is what the Ramban Nachmanides said about Yehoshua, that it says about Yehoshua, Isha sheruach ba, sheyachal lalech neged ruchi shekol echad ve'echad v'chulu. That what did it mean that Yehoshua had the spirit within him? Is what it says. It means that he was able to speak to the ruach, to the spirit, to the spiritual state of each and every person. And that's what let him be a godly leader, like Moshe Rabbeinu was before him. Yoshua was able to be a godly leader because God filled him with the special ability that he could speak to each and every person. The emphasis again being that it wasn't because Yoshua was very smart, right? In other words, it doesn't say God made him the greatest chacham. The greatest chacham cannot speak to each and every person because chachma, wisdom, is limited. right? Human wisdom is limited. There's a special divine gift. It's something Eloki, it's something godly to be able to speak to each and every person. And I'd just like to point out, and this is my own parallel that I'm drawing here, so don't, we are now speaking parenthetically, not within the text of the Tanya, and not within any of the Sfarim I read to comment on Tanya. I would just like to point something out, which is that this idea that only God can speak to each and every perspective, each and every frame of reference, you would say in a more modern or more, a more scientific language. Only God can speak to each and every frame of reference. This idea is a recurring theme in Yiddishkeit in general. In Judaism in general, you see this profound idea, and not even just with people, but with many things that I'm going to talk about in a second, that only God speaks to each and every frame of reference. And there's a fundamental reason for this. The reason is, most things in Yiddishkeit go back to like one of two or three, you could say, fundamental points. The reason for this, as so many other things, are explained by the idea that God creates everything yesh ma'ayin. God creates everything something from nothing. In other words, I just want to point out, I think this parenthetical will help us appreciate the third point that we're going to read tonight, which is that the reason God can speak to 600,000 people, all to them as if he were them, right, is because all things in Yiddishkeit come from God, something from nothing. In other words, let me put it to you this way. Someone trying to write a book for you based on human intellect to try and help you with your life is another something. It's a something, it's a yesh, trying to speak to another yesh. You're another something. And a something trying to speak to another something is possible. They can communicate, they can share, they can connect, right? But at the end of the day, this one is limited to being this something, and this one is limited to being this something. And there's limits. There's limits to what's communicable. There's limits to what's shareable, to what you can share, what you can know of another person in return. Right? There's limits because it's a something with his every yesh. When we say the human intellect is finite, it's a different way of saying it's a yesh, it's a something. Because every something is defined by ad per vesulay, as we would say. Until here and no further. Every something is defined by its gather, by where it belongs. It's not what makes something, right? As we said when we were learning a very long time ago, when we were learning mitzvahs hamanos alakus from Tzemach Tzedek, if anyone can remember that. A long time ago, when we said that the reason time and space exist is so that everything doesn't happen all at once and all on the same spot, right? That's what time and space do, is they let you spread it out. The reason time exists is so everything doesn't happen all at once, and the reason space exists is so that everything's not all in one spot, right? So it's the same thing here. A yesh is defined by zman u'makom. He's defined by where he's not, right? He has limits. He is limited within this space and within this time, right? And in the full meaning of what those terms mean, which we can't get into tonight, yeah? So, a yesh, a something, a creation is defined by their limits. Their limits is what defines them, yes? It shouldn't be too difficult. The only difficult part of it is that it seems so obvious that you almost can't put it into words because it's so obvious. That's the difficult part here. This is very standard. It's the ayin that's difficult for us to understand. The yesh we understand very well. Everything is defined by what it's not, by its limits, by what when we say what a yesh is, that's a different way of saying this is its limits. Yeah, if I say that this is what the chair is, right, that means it's for sitting on and not for playing music on. You understand what I'm saying? In that sense, every yesh is defined by its limit, right? Or if it's blue, that means because it's not red. Yeah? A yesh and a yesh, a seichel and another seichel, a person writing a book and a person reading a book, they can touch, they can connect, they can exchange information, they can go together, but there's limits. There's limits because ultimately they're not one yesh. That's why I said, if I knew him, I would be him. Ultimately, these are two different creations. Yes? Everything I'm saying is more complicated than it is. So if you have questions, that's why, because everything I'm saying is more complicated, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for our purposes. I'm saying it's simple. There's a yesh and a yesh, and because the one is one creation, one is another creation, right? Why is God accepted from this? Because he knows everything not as it's a yesh, but in its source, right? Everything comes forth from him. And nothing has any power, as we discussed elsewhere in Yiddishkeit, to change how it comes forth from him. That's what it means we don't believe in idols, right? God is the only true power in the universe and the only true reality in the universe, and everything comes forth from him. And therefore, the fact that there are 600,000 different yeshes, 600,000 different finite creations, to him it doesn't matter. Why? Because he's not another yesh trying to understand these things from the outside. This is like so important. It's so important and so never put into words. So I'm trying to put it into words for you, right? It's so basic. Once you learn it, you'll see it in every page of the Tanya. Every page, right? God is not looking at the 600,000 people from the outside as another yesh. God knows them from the inside because he's their makor. He's the ayin which they come forth from. He doesn't have to know 600,000 people from above, so to speak. That's not what we mean by Chacham Arazim. What we mean Chacham Arazim is that where do you think these 600,000 yeshus, what are they a development of? Where do they come forth from? What are they nothing other, right, than the ayin of Hashem? So he doesn't know from the outside 600,000. He knows from the inside.
He knows from both.
Yes. Well, yes, that's a separate. Like I said, I'm oversimplifying, right? There's also the issue where we're not really two separate yeshus. There's the other issue.
Right.
Oh, both are true. It doesn't matter. This is the point. The point is that God knows from the inside. You know where else you see this idea? This is really a parenthetical. Where else you see this idea is when the Rambam writes. Have you ever learned the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah? It's vitally important. Really, I should assign it as homework. I don't know if you're allowed to assign homework in this class. Really, you should assign as homework that before everyone finishes Shabbos, by the end of Shabbos, you should read the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah. It's like everything that you always wanted to know is in the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, where the Rambam explains how the Torah works. It's absolutely fascinating. The Rambam has a sefer Pirush HaMishnah, right? He has a commentary on the Mishnah. The Hakdama, the introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah, is like all the best stuff, all the most interesting things are in the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah. Highly recommended. Basic Judaism. Yeah, the Hakdama to Pirush HaMishnah. So the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah. Sometimes written as the Hakdama, sometimes it's just called the Hakdama to the Mishnah, or even the Hakdama to the Talmud, right? It depends how what printing it is.
What kind of category would you put this book in?
The Hakdama?
Yeah.
The Hakdama is, it's an introduction, you mean, it's a commentary on the Mishnah, I guess, would be the place to look for it. I don't know if it would be a Machshavet Yisrael. It's the commentary on the Mishnah, that's the Sefer, so it's a Mishnah commentary. Anyway, so the Rambam says there that it's very interesting. He's talking about prophets, right? A Navi. And he's saying, because Nevuah is very important, the whole understanding of what the concept of prophecy is, which, by the way, is a very, it's a topic that not a lot of people know a lot about. It's something that requires study and requires understanding. The Rebbe has very interesting sichos about Nevuah, about prophecy. So the Rambam writes there that the way you establish a Jewish prophet, right, because the Torah says in Parshas Re'eh, I believe, that God will send false prophets, right? You have to not believe them. It's a test, right? Not a test for him, but a test for us, as the famous commentaries go. And you have to not believe the false prophet. So the Rambam, in Introduction to the Mishnah, explains how you distinguish between a true prophet and a false prophet. And the Rambam explains there, what's the difference between a Navi Sheker and a Navi Amiti B'Yisrael? He says that you have to test him by asking him to predict the future. And in fact, it's apparent from the words of the Rambam, I believe, that the Rambam holds that this test was given to all of the famous Nevi'im in the Torah. In other words, all of the Nevi'im that we know in all the Sfarim in the Tanakh, they could all pass this test, right? Shmuel could do it, and Yeshayahu could do it, right, etc., right? The test is you have to ask them to predict the future, and predict the future accurately and multiple times, right? And if the Rambam says if they're wrong on one detail, it's a false prophet.
It's as long as the Mishnah, this Hakdama.
Yeah, it's very long, right? How can it contain all the good things if it's not long? So how many? You thought there were so few good things. You have to be more optimistic.
It's longer than the Mishnah.
I told you it contains all the good things, so you have to be more optimistic. It has to be longer. So you can get this, by the way, as a book fully translated into English as well. You can get it because I don't think it'll be hard to find a free English translation.
How am I supposed to finish by the end of Shabbos?
Oh, because we may or may not have the book, so don't worry about it.
Yes, it's free.
I don't think it's in English on there. Anyway, good.
The problem is you need another Agdama to understand what he wrote here.
No, it's straightforward. No, skip the poetry at the beginning. Get to the... Anyway, although the poem is very beautiful at the beginning. Anyway, you have to test, the true prophet is able to predict the future accurately to every detail. If they get one detail wrong, it's a false prophet. Right? That's what the Rambam writes there. And that's how you test a true Jewish prophet, right? How come only a true prophet is able to predict the future accurately in every detail, right? Some people can predict the future accurately in a broader way, right? And we say in a certain way, we say that in a way a chacham is better than a navi, right? Because a wise person can see implicit in the present what's going to happen in the future, which is of course how all of our modern forms of prediction work. That's how a meteorologist does it when he's right. It's how Warren Buffett does it, who's right more often than the meteorologist, it would seem, right? You predict the future by looking at the present, right? The problem is that no one can do that perfectly in every detail and multiple times in a row, right? Why can only a true prophet do that? The answer is because God tells them. That's the answer, right? Which is the same principle here. You see why it's the same principle. Because any person with finite human intellect trying to predict the future, right, their intellect only goes so far. They can't account for all the other yesh that's in the universe, which is a mind-bogglingly, way beyond the ability of any human being to understand. All the other finite creations within the universe that they can't know unless they become that creation, right? So it's literally impossible for the human intellect to truly predict the consequences of the present, right? The human intellect cannot account for every other finite being. The only person that can do that is the one who knows it all within their source. I don't have a problem saying God's a person in a certain sense. It's no worse than saying God's not a person, by the way, technically. It might make people more nervous. That's the only thing. That's the only reason why it's worse. But some of us might think that's better, and some people might. I think it's better. I think that's why it's better. I explained this to an 8-year-old the other day, and they seem to understand it. Which is that you call God a person when you want to explain that he's much more like a person than he's like a rock or a computer program, which many people assume and then feel good about themselves because they're not saying God is a person, which is a terrible mistake. Anyway, that's a different discussion for a different time. I could explain it to you at such length that you would have to agree with me, but I'll let you continue in your blissful ignorance. So the whole idea that you can predict truly what's going to happen in the future is not possible as a finite yesh, as something looking at other things from the outside. It's only something that God can do. It's the same idea you have here in the Tanya, right? It's the same idea here. Only God can know them from the reason God is able to know everyone's perspective and speak to all of them is because he's not just another thing that's very smart knowing them from the outside, because nothing that's not you can know you 100% from the outside. That's the way God made the universe, and you know this yourself to be true. So, the reason God is able to know you and speak to your needs is because he's not from the outside, in this sense. He's not from the outside as another finite yesh trying to know another yesh who's limited as a defined being. God is not limited as a defined being in this way, and in fact, all limited defined beings come forth from him, and as we learned at great length in Tanya and also in the Maimer of the Rebbe Rashab we just finished, are really nothing more than an expression of him, or nothing more than an expression of the divine ayin, of the divine nothingness that transcends. If calling God a person is a problem, certainly calling God nothing is much worse, right? No. It's much worse. A person at least has some quality, and God nothing. Anyway, the whole idea that you can know the finite beings is because he knows them from the inside. Yeah. So that's the Alter Rebbe's second point. This is, until here, we learned last week with much more elaboration. Yes? Last week we learned the first reason you can't replace a teacher with a sefer is because of bias. The second reason is because of parochialism. No sefer based on human intellect, no book based on human intellect can know another person, right? And what's the implication, by the way? That a teacher would be able to know you much better, right? A teacher would be able to know you much better and would be able to know what your problem is so that they could work, once they know your problem, they could work to address it, right? Assuming that they could know it, etc. Yeah. Now we go to the third stage, and hopefully with this long preparation, we'll understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying, and we'll see how it's how it's progressive, how this is yet a higher level. So continuing now, it's halfway down the paragraph that starts Hinei Mudas on page 6 of the Tanya. Yeah, it says Ela Afilu, new sentence. Yeah. Ela Afilu b'sifrei Yira Asher Yesodasam b'harei Kodesh, and even in those works teaching fear of God that are founded and based on mountains of holiness, meaning Midrashei Chazal, the Torah exegesis, the expounding of the Torah by the sages, Asher Ruach Hashem diber ba'am, that the Spirit of God speaks within them. In other words, what if the book I'm learning is not a book that mixes in the finite perspective of another creation, but is rather just bringing to me the teachings of the sages, and the Midrashei Chazal means how the holy sages were able to unpack the Torah, right? Meaning this Sefer is just another unpacking of the Torah, which is an infinite process, right? Which is why you can always have more Sfarim, you can always have more books, because all they do is they're unpacking the Torah further, right? In the holiest sense, in the sense that they're just a continuation of the great chain of tradition, which is all based on prophecy and holy teaching. In other words, never mind that we were talking about before, about human parochialism, right? That a human mind cannot really speak to my problem directly. But what about if I'm not learning a human book? What if I'm learning a book that has the wisdom of God, right? The very wisdom that allows Yehoshua to speak to each and every person, right? What if this Sefer is of that wisdom, right? In other words, what if this Sefer speaks to me, so to speak, like Yehoshua does, Kaviyachol, right? Like Joshua does, with the spirit, not of his own human intellect, but of the infinite mind of Hashem, the infinite knowing of God, which knows everyone from the inside, right? That the Torah certainly speaks to each and every person, right? As we're going to say. And we know that the Torah and God are all one, which is the basis of what I'm saying, the basis of this point, that works based on true holy Torah, with no mixing in of the finite human perspective, right? They have the perspective of God, because the Torah and God are absolutely united. And furthermore, not only is the Torah and God united, so the Torah speaks with the perspective that speaks to each and every person, but the kol shishim riba neshamas kol Yisrael uprateim ad nitzutz kal shebakalim upuchutei erech sheba'amenu b'nei Yisrael kulam miskashrayin ba'eraisa v'eraisa miskashrayin v'isana HaKadosh Baruch Hu k'neda b'Zohar HaKodesh. I read a lot, let me translate. And each of the 600,000 general soul roots of the Jewish people, a Kabbalistic concept that even though there's more than 600,000 Jews, all Jewish souls are based on 600,000. Right. The soul root. There's 600,000 root souls, of which all the souls are branches. Right. So all 600,000 root souls of Israel. And prateim, and their subcategories, which means the individual souls. Prateim, and even further division down, right, into the literal individuals, right? Until you get to the spark of the kal shebakalim, which is a term we'll see recurring in Tanya. The kal shebakalim means literally the lightest of the lightest, which means, see how they translate it? the most worthless and least estimable members of our people, is how they translate the Kalsha B'Kalim B'chutei Arech. Well, I have good news for you. There has never been a Kalsha B'Kalim that knew what the phrase Kalsha B'Kalim meant, or that it was mentioned in Tanya. So you're already excluded. Right? Because the most worthless Jew, meaning the least connected, would not be learning Tanya, so it's already too late. We're already not the Kal Shebekalim, which is important because we're going to use the Kal Shebekalim as a Kal V'chema for us later, right? We're going to say, if this is true of even those Jews who haven't had the merit to come to Thursday night Chassidus class, right, then all the more so it's going to be true about me, about us, right? So even the most worthless, even the lowliest Jew with the lowest expressed qualities, the lowest expressed greatness, right? All of them are connected to the Torah, and the Torah connects them to God. Right? This is famously what the Zohar says. The Zohar says there's three knots, right, that are connected one to the other. There's the Jewish people and Torah and Hashem, and the Jewish people are connected to the Torah, and the Torah is connected to Hashem. So the Jewish people, and by the way, the Yisrael is famously a Resh Tevis, right? Yeshishim Riba Osias Lotera. There's 600,000 letters in the Torah, is what is an acronym for Israel. Right? There's 600,000 letters in the Torah. In other words, what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is like this. He's saying...
It's not really the case.
What? No. If you actually count the letters, it won't be 600,000, correct? It depends what you mean by really the case, that's all. But yes, you're right. If you actually count them, you will not find 600,000, which is a classic question. And the answer is that you have the black letters and the white letters is the classic answer, right? There's the letters that you see as the black, and then there's the white letters in between the letters, whatever that means. I don't know. Don't ask.
Every answer is going to be right in that case.
Yeah, well, you're speaking...
Imagine you're writing a test of the teacher and say, no, I wrote it, but there are some letters that are not written.
Maybe that's in fact the point. That's actually a very profound point now. Maybe that's exactly what it means. I'm not sure. That's interesting. We can't get too distracted. The point is, what's the point of the saying 600,000? There's 600,000 letters in the Torah. It's Israel. The point is that the Jew and Torah and God are all connected in a very profound way, in the deepest possible way. The Jew is one with the Torah, and the Torah is one with God. Yes. In other words. A sefer that's written from the perspective of Torah, a sefer that is just an expanding and unfolding of Torah, right? That's just based on the Midrashei Chazal. That's just the holy words of our sages who themselves were just speaking the words of Torah, unpacking the words of the Holy Torah. Such a work not only doesn't speak with the limits of human intellect, because it speaks as Torah from the infinite perspective of Hashem, who knows everyone from the inside, but in fact is the very place where the deepest inside of each Jew comes from. Again, it doesn't just speak to each person's issues from the inside. Each person's issues, in other words, each Jew's finite being, the spark of their soul, of the least connected Jew, where does it derive from? Where does it get its shape? Where does it get all its qualities and all its experience and all its vitality and its whole life? It gets it from the Torah itself. So in other words, when a Jew learns Torah, he is learning from something that knows the experience of each and every individual person from the inside, and not only that, he is in fact encountering his own source. He is in fact encountering the place that his individual perspective actually derives from, in some mystical sense, right? It's not clear exactly how that is. Fine, maybe that's a discussion for a different time. But in some sense, we are taught in the Zohar, when a Jew studies Torah, he is encountering the source of his own soul, the source of his own being. So in other words, like this, you don't have the problem of bias, of limitation of the Jew to understand Torah. Why? No, the limitation of the Jew, because the limitations of the Jew, where do all the Jews' limitations ultimately find their source? They ultimately find their source in the Torah, their soul, their individual soul's abilities, right? The fact that its seichel is able to understand so much, and the aveda it's able to do is so much. All of that is determined, right? Its hard limits are determined by its source in the Torah, right? And you don't have the issue of parochialism. You don't have the issue of that it's speaking to someone else's situation. Why? Because it speaks from the perspective of the Creator. It's the Chachmas Hashem. It's the wisdom of God. And therefore, like Yeshua could speak to each and every person, the Sefer of pure Torah also speaks to each and every person. It's impossible that the Sefer of true Torah is not speaking to the Jew. Right? This is the situation Alter Rebbe is talking about. Yes. However, what's the problem? The Chlolos Yisrael. The Torah connects the Jew's soul to God and speaks in the situation of every Jew. In what state? In general. The Torah speaks only in generalities. In other words, not everyone merits to find the thing that is certainly in the Torah that they're learning that can help them, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is saying like this, and it's so in the way of the Alter Rebbe. It's so important before you get into Tanya that already in the Haggadah you see the Alter Rebbe's perspective, because the Alter Rebbe is saying like this: even if you get rid of your intellectual limitations, your bias, say you don't have bias, and even if you get rid of the parochialism of the human intellect, right? We're not even talking about human intellect. We are talking about, the Alter Rebbe is saying, we are talking about a mystical soul connection between the soul and what it says in the Torah. Your soul and what it says in the Torah, it's like Besher. They speak to you, they're made for each other. Your soul, the Torah knows you from the inside, you know Torah from the inside. In fact, these two things are not really two separate things. These are two things that are one, right? So when a Jew learns Torah. When a Jew learns Torah, it's one thing learning itself in a profound sense, right? In a profound sense. The Torah certainly speaks to you, and you certainly are able to receive and derive from the Torah, right? However, so in other words, the whole issue is not intellectual, it's not bias, it's not parochialism that the Sefer is not talking to you in this case. Nevertheless, there's still a problem with Sfarim. What's the problem with Sfarim? The problem with Sfarim is that all of this is only b'chlalos. In other words, yet for the entire Jewish people, this always holds true.
It's a common denominator.
Right? Yeah, for the entire Jewish people, the Torah is always speaking to the entire Jewish people. Now, the truth is that it's always talking to you specifically as well, but not everyone merits to find it. Not everyone merits, even though they have the intellect in place, and they're not intellectually limited, and they're not aveda limited, and they're not learning a Torah that's speaking to someone else. They're reading a Torah that speaks to them. They still don't merit to find the way that the Torah speaks to them. It's a much more refined problem we're talking about now. It's much more edel, right? They don't merit to find the way that the Torah is speaking to them. And even though the Torah was given in such a way that you can learn it both generally and specifically, in other words, even though the Torah is given in such a way that it certainly speaks to his individual situation, and even more detail, to the tiniest detail, it speaks to him. It's made to speak to him. To each and every individual Jewish soul, which is rooted in the Torah. In other words, even though the Torah specifically is definitely and certainly speaking to your specific individual experience, and the Torah is certainly doing this, there's no question, because your experience is nothing else other than an unfolding of the Torah itself. That's what your experience is. Your experience is rooted in the Torah and comes from the Torah. That's all your experience is. So certainly your experience is found in the Torah. Not everyone merits to find their specific part of the Torah. Even in the laws of forbidden and permitted that are revealed, in other words, they're in the revealed Torah, not the inner mystical Torah, but the halacha, right? even in the laws of what's permitted and forbidden, in the revealed law of the Torah, we find disagreement among the sages of the Mishnah and the sages of the Talmud, them disagreeing in the extremes, like from one extreme to the other. They disagree vehemently. One person says this is 100% permitted, one person says it's 100% forbidden. They can't disagree more. Black and white, mamash, literally.
And they're anakei olam.
Yes, ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. And both of these perspectives are the words of the living God, right? This is the famous source of the joke where the two people are arguing and they come to the rabbi and the rabbi tells this one you're right and this one you're right, and then his wife says how can they both be right? He says you're also right. Yeah, it's the famous story, right? This is the original source of the story, is in the Talmud, not literally that story, but the idea is in the Talmud, which is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, which means even though they disagree with irreconcilable positions, they can't both be right. Nevertheless, these and these are the words of the living God. They are both the words of Hashem, right? Which is a tricky thing to understand, right? And the meaning of this phrase, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, these and these are both the words of the living God, means that even though, as the Rebbe explained many times in Sichos and in talks, even though there can only be one halacha, even though there can only be one law, right? This food either has to be permitted or forbidden. It can't be both. Right? It's one of you is right. It can't be, but you can't be you're both right. Right? Only one of you can actually be right in the law. Yeah? That the thing where only one thing can be right is the profound will of God. The halacha is what God wants, right? Does he want you to avoid eating this food, or does he want you to partake in eating this food? Right? Is it permitted or is it forbidden? That's the will of God. Yeah, which comes from a very lofty place, and a place that's reached in a different way than what we're talking about. We are talking about the perspectives of the individual sages in unpacking the Torah, right? And what the Alter Rebbe's point is that we find this in the Holy Torah itself. In other words, when Shammai and Hillel disagree, for example, right, or Abaye and Rava, whatever your example is that you like, right? One says permitted, one says forbidden, right? The Alter Rebbe's point is like this: they're not disagreeing because each one comes with their bias, in the sense that they both have issues understanding the Torah. Right? In other words, they're not reached the level where they can understand what the Torah is saying, right? Because they're not approaching the Torah with those, they're not limited with those biases. They're also not coming with the problem of parochialism, that the Torah is speaking to something else. On the contrary, the topic they're talking about is what the Torah is talking about, right? They're learning Torah in the correct way, in the godly way. Right. Nevertheless, they can still come to totally opposite conclusions. Why? Because when one Jewish soul goes to find its part of the Torah, and a different Jewish soul goes to find its part of the Torah, right? The Torah can speak to different people differently. Right. The Torah can speak to one soul in its situation, and a different soul in its situation.
We find it even in the Amidah. We don't say Eloi Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We say Eloi Avraham, Eloi Yitzchak. It means the whole experience of godliness within each father. You go to ask Mr. Avinu, Avraham,
right?
What is God? Is going to give you a completely different description than Yitzchak.
Right. Right. Everyone has, and the issue is not the limitation of the receiver. That's the point. It's not the limitation of the receiver, and it's not the limits of the giver. You can have an unlimited giver, a ready receiver, right? And still, not everyone receives the same. The neshamas are different. The souls come from different aspects of that divine place, right? And just think about how much more of an elevated way of looking at these disagreements this is, right? Yeah. You could look at it as a simple, nobody really has the truth, right? Which is an extremely coarse and degrading way of looking at the process of looking at the sages, really, right? That each of them were insufficient, so they came to irreconcilable positions, right? If that were the case, they should both give up instead of saying Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, right? Why do we say these and these are the words of the living God? Because we believe profoundly that they're not just biased. It's not that they're biased, God forbid, or that there was a limit in the Torah in speaking to them, right? That the Torah somehow couldn't reach them in their place. On the contrary, we believe they had no bias. The Torah could reach them in their place, and yet still, their nitzutz, their spark of godliness, which is rooted in the Torah, comes from a different aspect or a different perspective, because the Torah is inherently multifaceted while still being infinite at the same time, however that's possible, right? It comes from a different aspect of the multifaceted Torah. It's a different spark. As the Alter Rebbe himself explains, the Elu divrei Elokim Chayim, these and these are the words of the living God. The Alter Rebbe makes a diuk. Why do we say the words of the Elokim Chayim? Elokim is the name of God, which is in the plural, right? God says, the Alter Rebbe says, Lashon Rabim, right? It's in the plural form. Why is it in the plural form? That these and these are the words of literally the living gods, if you want to translate with the plural name of God. It's interesting that God himself has a plural name. That's itself an interesting fact, right? We'll maybe touch on that later. Al Shem Makar HaChaim L'Neshamas Yisrael. Why is it called the living God, the words of the living God with the plural form, right? Because it's talking about the source of life, Makar Chachaim L'Neshamas Yisrael, for the souls of Israel. In other words, that aspect of the Torah which manifests in multiplicity, in difference, there's different aspects, right? Which is really the name Elokim, always refers to the source of multiplicity in Chassidus and Kabbalah, refers to the source of there being division instead of unity, right? Yeah, that's also interesting. That's interesting too. And the souls are themselves divided generally into three kaven, like into three rows, like in the famous drawing of the spheres, right? Which at some class we'll probably draw at some point, right? Yamen is small, the emtza. You have the right row, the left row, and the middle row. Shem chesed ugvura v'chulu, which are kindness and discipline, and the third row is tiferes, which is rachamim, right? Mercy. Souls which come from the root of kindness, they tend to judge in the way of kindness. And again, it's so important to understand, we're not talking about intellectual bias, we're talking about something more profound. Right. We're talking about soul bias, but you can't even call it a bias because it's just the nature of the soul itself. Yeah, it's the soul, literally the turning of the soul in one direction, whatever that means, right? But the point is that this is pre-rational. This is not, on the contrary, this is not a bias due to the limit of the intellect. This is what limits the intellect. This is the thing that determines itself, that itself will determine the limits of the intellect. The limits of the intellect only come afterward. This is before. It's the very shape, the very way the soul is in a way of kindness, and therefore its tendency is to seek out lahaka, is to seek out the lenient position, kaneda, right? And so, of course, the opposite, the other souls which come from the side of severity will seek out the more severe position, and of course the souls of tiferes. All of that is in the revealed aspect of the Torah, meaning it's in the aspect of the Torah that is debatable and meant to be debated and demonstrated all according to intellectual proof. That's the aspect of the Torah that comes fully into human rationality and human intellect. And even there, you see that the roots of the souls make rational reconciliation impossible. Right? This one is Hillel, his soul comes from Chesed. This one is Shammai, his soul comes from Gvura, and their opinions are opposite, even though they're talking about a practical issue of darshaning a pasuk. How do we learn out and understand this verse? Right? Which you would think you couldn't be more mundane. We're not talking, that's not a spiritual practice, that seems to be an intellectual practice. Nevertheless, the soul, because of its root in the Torah, even though the soul has the ability to understand Torah, and the Torah has the ability to speak to the soul, they still only get their piece of the Torah, right? And all the more so when we're talking about the Nistaris L'Hashem Elokeinu, the secrets of the Torah, the hidden aspect of the Torah, which is far less rationalized and brought into solid and mundane human intellect when you're talking about lofty and abstract matters, which are much more inward and private and subjective and spiritual, right? Meaning the love and fear that is within each and every person's brain and heart, each person according to their level, every person according to their heart's estimation, their heart's ability to measure. As it says in the Zohar, which is of course is a quote from Eshes Chayil, right? We say Friday night, Neda B'Sharim Baila means her husband is known at the gates, right? But Neda B'Sharim Baila, the Zohar explains that who's the husband of the Jewish people is God, right? In the allegory, right? God, the whole Eshes Chayil is talking about the Jewish people. The Jewish people is the Eshes Chayil, and the Zohar explains, it's one interpretation of the Eshes Chayil, of course, I should say, right? That Neda B'Sha'arim Baila means God is known at the gates. Shar, which means gate, is the same language as Alter Rebbe just said, is the same language of shiur, as measure. And it means that God is known, sort of like Ronnie was saying, that God is known according to each and every person's measure. Neda B'Sha'arim Baila means that her husband is known according to the Sha'arim, the multiple measures. Every person's measure, right, knows God. So what's this whole discussion? Let's go back, because I'm going to get lost when we'll conclude, right? Let's go back. The Torah, even once you get past the coarse limitations of bias and the parochialism of a yesh, even of the parochialism, the limits, the narrow-mindedness of a human mind, right? Even when it's not a human mind, even when it's the knowledge of God, it's a sefer of true Torah, right? The wisdom of God, which is surely speaking to each and every soul. And the soul is certainly reading, and is certainly in this Torah finds the exact guidance that is speaking to its particular situation. Because every one of its situations is rooted in the Torah. Its whole life, its whole being is rooted in the Torah. Right? So the Torah and the soul are directed toward each other. They have the answer. The Torah has the answer for this specific soul, as a single individual. It has the answer to my specific situation and the guidance for my specific situation. And that Torah, and I'm studying that Torah. Nevertheless, it still can't replace a teacher. Why can't it replace a teacher? It can't replace a teacher because not everyone merits to find to make the connection between my soul and Torah. Not because we're biased, right? But because we're talking about something very, very profound and ephemeral, right? The love and fear of each and every person according to their own personal situation, right? It's something very, very specific, very personal, right? Very subjective. And not everybody is able, if even in the revealed aspect of the Torah, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel came away with their particular needs, all the more so in the hidden aspects of the Torah, right? That there's a specific message of the Torah that speaks to you, but it's that much harder to get to. It's that much harder, right, to get the conclusion, right? If even Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, there had to be some kind of further step to arrive at the halacha, how is every Jew supposed to find in the Sefer of the Torah the halacha for their own life, right? If even Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, even Shammai and Hillel, or Abaye and Rava, were disagreeing about the practical halacha, right, then how am I supposed to find the practical directive that I know is right for my own life, right? How can a book do that? How can a Sefer of the Torah do that? If there's a teacher, a true Torah teacher, a true sage, right? A true teacher of the Torah, they'll be able to help me find in the Torah my chelik, right? We say v'sein chelkeinu b'sarasecha, my part of the Torah, the part of the Torah that tells me and explains to me exactly what my direction is in my specific circumstance and my specific situation, right? But so I would say that the third step, in one way of putting it, I would say rather than bias and rather than parochialism, narrow-mindedness, I would call the third step, I would call it subjectivity.
Ofi. Character. Each one is
subjectivity and character is very similar. Similar, yeah. Subjectivity, character, in other words, that even when I have no bias, and even when the Torah is certainly speaking specifically to my situation, nevertheless, there's still a certain estrangement that's possible. It's still possible that I'm not able to get out of this Torah, which is trying to speak to me the specific teaching for my specific situation. It's very, very difficult, and not everyone has the divine merit. So I need the help of a teacher, right, to bring this down and explain it to me properly, right? So I just want to point out that from the beginning of the Hakdama, Alter Rebbe goes from the human being, the human mind has limits, and you just might not be able to get the right thing out of this book, right? But Alter Rebbe, by the end of this paragraph, is saying that even someone whose literal soul is speaking to the soul of Torah, to its own root, right? It's no longer about understanding an intellectual concept. We're so far beyond that. It's about the soul returning to its place. It's about the soul resolving its estrangement from its own root, right? The Alter Rebbe says it's still very difficult. A person can be in a situation where even when the two sides are trying to reach each other, even when this Torah, which certainly speaks to my soul, and my soul, which knows that its root and its truth and its hadracha and its direction and its all of these things, or its lesson is in Torah, there can still be a gap that can't be crossed. It can still be too difficult to cross the gap. So you need a teacher, right, to help guide your soul back to its makar in Torah, which is a much more edel and refined understanding for the role of the teacher than simply chasing you off with the stick and saying you're too limited to understand this. Right?
And yet you wrote the book.
Well, we'll get to that, but the point is that when the Alter Rebbe explains why he's writing the book nevertheless, what does he have to answer? He has to answer all three of these points. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is not just answering the point of the coarsest reason why a book can't replace a teacher. The Alter Rebbe is going to answer the most edel, the most profound, the most this issue where a soul can learn Torah, but it can't find its place. It can't find its part of the Torah. It can't find its own source. The soul is seeking, and the Torah is trying to teach it, but the two things remain estranged, right? And normally you would need a teacher in person to overcome that blockage or to overcome that gap. The Alter Rebbe is going to explain why nevertheless he wrote the Sefer, despite this fact. Right? And that's what we'll continue next week.
The whole purpose of the book is actually to realize and understand better yourself.
Yes, very profoundly.
But the rules of the Torah